There's a long history in development studies on the question of how agricultural production in smallholder contexts relates to nutrition and health. Until recently, this question I think was framed in quite static and narrow terms with regard to the issue of whether smallholders specialising in commercial production were better off than smallholders specialising in self-sufficiency and growing more diverse crops. In 2010, Anna Herforth published a PhD, and I think this was a very useful contribution. Her work on traditional vegetables in East Asia reframed this debate from those static terms into the more dynamic terms that we're familiar with today. And her PhD allowed us to ask more complex questions about not just whether smallholders were growing for market or growing for themselves, but the extent to which they were doing both those activities, given that it's rare these days in the contemporary developing world that a smallholder will be exclusively within the self-sufficiency domain or the market domain. And these insights were timely also because sort of across the Indian Ocean from East Africa, in India there was increasing concern about the Indian nutrition enigma. The previous session discussed that, particularly with regards to the fact that high economic growth in India was not generating nutritional dividends. And researchers, particularly based around clusters in IFPRI, were associated with reframing that debate into the agriculture-nutrition disconnect and looking at the pathways that connected production with nutritional and health outcomes. And as we heard in the previous section of this conference, gender was a mediating factor in many of these arrangements. I think the work by IFPRI and Anna Herforth's work in Africa we can think of those as petri dishes for what's been a sort of a flourishing of debate on this in recent years on this topic of production diversity and nutrition diversity. And as we all know, there's been a large literature in a very small space of time, including a quite influential 2015 special issue of the Journal of Development Studies. Before I talk about the results from our work in Myanmar on this topic, I want to emphasise what I see as some cautionary tales about how we might interpret data coming from this literature. And I'm not saying that publications in this literature ignore these cautions. I think a lot of the literature does acknowledge these, but I think it's worthwhile just to very briefly talk about these three cautions and how we might interpret this relationship. The first is what I call a temporal disjuncture. We've heard about this earlier today in one of the papers. Typically, farm production data is collected on the basis of number of crops grown over a 12-month cycle. Typically, not always, dietary diversity data is collected on the basis of 24-hour recalls. Of course, production is seasonal. If we don't understand the cyclical links between production arrangements and when the 24-hour recall survey was conducted, the findings we have to treat them very cautiously. There will be big, I think, problems in universally extrapolating from findings if we don't understand that seasonality. The second disjuncture, I've called it there, is the own consumption disjuncture. We've heard about that in this conference as well. This is where assumptions that because a farm produces a particular type of food, the availability then conflates into access for household members. Yesterday, my colleague from the University of Sydney, Johanna Wong, talking about Timor-Leste, made that very point. She was saying that her sample had lots of chickens, but chicken meat was not eaten by many in her sample because, I think in the words of one of her respondents, it's like eating money. Unless we understand the subtleties of that dynamic, again, conclusions are very difficult to establish. Or there needs to be caution based around the analysis of data. The third disjuncture, which surprisingly I think we've heard very little in this conference, is what I call a livelihood disjuncture. There is often an assumption that, firstly, the rural equates to agriculture, so households in the rural areas of Africa and South Asia particularly are farm households, and we assume that if they're farm households, they are farmers and doing nothing else. And particularly me as a human geographer, the social science literature I read continually talks about the diversification of the non-farm economy and the fact that many farm-based households are actually these days earning a majority of their livelihoods from non-farm activities. And again, I think unless we understand some of those subtleties, we have to sort of put caution around some of the data. And this is an example of this. I haven't quite introduced our study yet, but in terms of livelihood diversity, this is results from our own survey in Myanmar that I'll briefly outline in a moment, and from the two regions that I'll primarily talk about in this presentation today. Landless households were, 65% of the sample. Landholders were the rest. Within the landholder cohort, you really get down to about 25% of the total sample who were landholders only doing agriculture. So the whole debate about agricultural diversity and dietary diversity is sometimes we can think of that as being relevant to maybe only a quarter or so of the entire population in rural areas of the areas that we're studying. I think that's an important caution to make as well. So onto the study itself. The data I'm going to talk about here relates to a household survey we conducted in 2016 of livelihoods and food security across 3 different sites, 3 different states in Myanmar that were chosen on agroclimatic grounds to pick up 3 different dynamics of agriculture in the country. The hilly region of Chin, which is the furthest north in that map, I'm not going to talk about those results today because the land holding data is very difficult to disentangle because much of the land is held communally, and communal title makes it difficult for a whole range of reasons. So the other 2 sites, the dry zone and the delta, are the areas I'll talk about today. I can talk more about method, but I won't for reasons of time. One of the key innovations that we've adopted in this study too is when we collect data on food production. Of course, we collect data on what landholders are growing in the fields and what animals they might be tending, but we're also including home gardens, wild foods, and pond and river caught fish, which is a very important part of diets in some areas, and also vines and trees that are on communal land that are foraged, the products of which are foraged from. So, compared to some other contributors to this debate, our definition of own production is much more inclusive. Our dietary diversity data was collected on the basis of 24-hour recall. All these data were coded according to minimum dietary diversity for women categories, and we followed it up with a mixed method approach involving focus groups and in-depth interviews. I've got just a couple of quick slides talking about some of the descriptive statistics. These 2 slides represent what I think is the food environment for the 2 samples. This first one relates to the Delta region, and you can see there the various food categories on the x-axis. And if you focus on the cross-hatched area, they're the number of households that were both producers and consumers of that same food group. So as you can see, dietary diversity is relatively narrow. In this case, everyone's eating rice, that's starchy staples. Flesh foods is basically fish, and about half of households were, on the 24-hour recall data, eating something more diverse. These are the data for the central dry zone, which look quite different in their diversity, but for reasons of time I won't go into that. So onto the conclusions, which is probably where I should focus my last few minutes. And I've got 4 different conclusions that I want to talk about here, and there's a little bit of subtlety in the way I'm expressing these, which I think speaks to, some of the complexity. And I must say, these conclusions are drawn from our data. To some extent, we've considered them in the context of our qualitative work, but that's still work to be done. So, in a sense, this is tentative results, if nothing else. So the first question we're posing is a yes/no question. Do households that are growing food, do they have more dietary diversity than households not growing food? And we can see there that the data seems to suggest a positive relationship according to our probate analysis, and we've controlled for wealth and a whole lot of other socio-economic factors. The marginal effects show that households that were producing 3 or more food groups had a statistically significant 9.11 percentage points higher probability of being in the highest dietary diversity group. So that's consistent with a lot of other results we've heard, and sort of consistent with much of the literature about own consumption contributing to dietary diversity, as I said, contingent to some of those cautions I said earlier. The big question is why, and when we get around to looking at our qualitative data in more depth, hopefully we'll be able to come to some conclusions on that. The second conclusion is, in a sense, we're cutting down that overall sample and thinking about only those households that produced food for own consumption, which can include landless households when they have home gardens, which is a minority of that sample, but that's another story. We're also seeing positive associations existing between own production of food and diversity of consumption based on our dietary diversity scores. I haven't put up the numbers here. If anyone's eager to see that, we can certainly make them available. Third, and this is where I think it gets a little bit more interesting in terms of challenging or throwing more questions into the way these debates are normally said. If we filter the data one step further and focus just on those households that were landholders and had farm-based livelihood arrangements only, which is that sort of 25% of the sample that I put up in a previous slide, the interesting thing is they were found to have less diverse diets and less food security, which is another dynamic I'll talk about in a moment, than landholding households that also had like 1 foot in the farm and 1 foot in the non-farm economy. And I think what this suggests, and this is where I think it's important, is that when sometimes we say, well, a land holding means more dietary diversity, it could be not the land holding per se, it could be the sort of the leveraging from land holding into the non-farm economy to have two sources of livelihood that can be a critical factor in encouraging more diverse diets, and presumably better diets. And we're going to unpack that with our qualitative data. Fourthly the interesting thing is that if households produce food for own consumption, we're finding in terms of food security, which is the sort of HFIAS definition we're using, they're not found to be more food secure than households not producing for food security, which again speaks to the dominance of the non-farm economy as an engine of change in rural Myanmar. So I've got some policy implications down the bottom there. I guess my closing comment would be, I think the work, and certainly the way that we think about our work, is that the sort of the two-way relationship between dietary diversity and production diversity needs to be joined by a third leg, which is livelihood diversity, if we're going to capture a fuller sense of what's going on in rural economy with regards to nutrition, health and food security. Thank you.